Welcome, everybody. My name is Gabriel Nguyen. I am the Asia Regional Director for Green Empowerment. And in the capacity of this project, I'm the strategic lead for the Sabah Renewable Energy Roadmap. We've got a couple of cool speakers today. The subject of today's discussion is enabling policies for mini-grid expansion. And what I think we want to talk to you about today is, well, obviously policies and regulatory frameworks that have been implemented around the world to facilitate renewable energy expansion. And we have a couple speakers for you who will introduce. I'm going to start by just giving a little bit of an overview of the past session for those who were unable to attend, and just as to kind of jog your memory of where we're at with all of that. And we're also going to, after my presentation, have a little bit of a quiz to make sure you're paying attention within the Zoom feature. And then we're also going to have some breakout rooms where you'll have a chance to participate. Let us know your thoughts. Let us know where you think Sabah's renewable energy framework and policies can improve, and where we can use existing tools. And that's kind of going to be the run of show for today. So I'll start with my presentation, introduce the two speakers, and then we'll go into their presentations. So just as a recap of our mission, and this came out of a joint process with you guys of what our kind of general long-term goals are for this this project, not this project specifically, but just sort of in the long term, what we're hoping to achieve in Sabah. I think, you know, some of the key things here are that we'd really like to see increased renewable energy generation in Sabah, starting with.
You're not seeing your screen, Gabe.
Oh, you're not. Sorry about that. How's this?
Still not. Still not. We saw it for a moment, and then when you hit the % button, it went back.
No, thanks, Ken. I can't really use that. Yeah.
Now?
Yep.
Yep.
Okay, so this is the mission. And I think, yeah, like I said, generally, we'd like to see increased renewable energy generation in the state. And we had talked about some key issues in some of our previous breakout rooms around the types of financing we'd need, the kinds of strategies around community engagement and technologies, which I'll dive into a little bit later. But these were kind of the general milestones and goals we'd laid out for ourselves. So as a recap from the last session, what is a mini-grid? You know, just as a reminder, and also for those of you joining us for the first time, what we're talking about when we're referring to a mini-grid is, in most cases, a standalone energy system. At times, it can also be interconnected to the main grid as a kind of a future consideration. But for most intents and purposes, it's a distribution network that is independently supplying electricity to a local group of customers, right? So the generation sources can be PV, so solar photovoltaic or hydro, or a diesel genset, or any number of, or combination of technologies. So what we talked about last time in terms of the real world mini-grid implementation sort of lessons, we talked about investing in anchor loads or productive end uses. You know, this could be anything from things like community rice mills, sort of tea processing plants, or even public facilities like schools and clinics that can help sustain the mini-grid during off-peak hours. And the need to invest in technologies that facilitate load management, right? A lot of the times we are dealing with situations where we have to manage the loads more efficiently than we might have to in on-grid circumstances. So we talked a little bit about the types of technologies that we could use to ensure that the load is distributed throughout the day. We talked a little bit about the how important stage engagement and capacity is in being able to extend energy access to some of the poorest customers in a given region. We talked a lot about training, education, capacity building of local stakeholders, communities, operators, things like that. We talked just generally about how important service levels are, and just that if we can guarantee reliable service, that people are more willing to pay for that service. So we also dove into community-based mini-grids specifically. These are some new slides, but they kind of summarize what we talked about last time in terms of both how community ownership models can really guarantee, or I should say, can help ensure the success of a mini grid, while also down the road potentially improving the way in which that grid could eventually be integrated into the main grid. Here we're looking at some of the key enabling factors as well, which we'll address throughout this my presentation, and probably in the presentations of the next two speakers as the key enabling factors. Policy and regulatory frameworks are obviously one of those. And some of the other ones that we'd identified specific to this process were the simplification of some of the administrative processes that have to do with setting up a mini grid, access to finance, and then community capacity building. So I wanted to talk now just what we've achieved so far as part of the roadmap process. You know, what we're trying to do generally as part of this process is bring some of the lessons learned in the 40 or so community-based projects we've already developed within Malaysia, and bring them into a more scaled approach, while also trying to have a kind of data-driven approach and a more collaborative approach with you guys, with those of you who are in the civil service in the public sector. You know, what we've started with is a big mapping project of the villages that are not electrified yet, or we suspect to be unelectrified, or electrified only to a certain degree, right? Like without 24-hour energy access. So we've mapped at this point about 450 villages, including some of their nearby resources and infrastructure. Our field teams, even throughout COVID, have managed to visit over 100 villages to be included in our demand study, with a eventual target of 200. We've identified 40 villages for mini-grid feasibility studies. Most of this legwork is being done by TONIBUNG, who's on this call as well. And you know, Green Empowerment has developed some tools for designing and planning those mini-grids. And then we've also done some initial policy analysis. As more data comes in from you guys, we've got an NDA signed, I think, with SESB now, and we'll be in the process of integrating that new data into our models and our policy analysis. And then we've also been having some discussions with potential financial institutions to support this project moving forward. So I also wanted to show you this kind of cool little map. This is going to be kind of the base feature of what we're presenting. What we really wanted to do is not like just produce a report that just kind of sits in somebody's filing cabinet for the next 5 years, but you know, have an interactive tool where we're able to see what the status of some of these villages are in real time. So as we extend energy access, we can start to see some of these villages come online. We can start to see what types of land use, some of the remoteness indicators that we've developed to see you know, what the likelihood or costs of extending energy access to those villages might be, whether through the grid or whether we're looking at alternative options. Sorry, I have to exit that. So the question now is, how do we replicate success at scale? I think, you know, the main factor for those of us looking at policy is how are we going to create an enabling environment for a successful mini grid rollout, right? We can you know, we can come to understand and support a lot of the technologies available in creating efficient, reliable, and safe mini grids. I think that that's also a priority, right? We want to create an enabling environment, but we also want to make sure that the mini grids that we're developing are safe to use, are reliable, and that they're being run efficiently. You know, we've talked a lot about recognizing the role of communities, not just as consumers and residential customers, but as contributors to the energy ecosystem. So what we, I think one of the newer concepts that we'll hear about today is the role of setting tariffs and how it can be used not just as a means to recover costs, but to incentivize improved management and load distribution, right? And I think identifying an analytical framework where both, you know, reliable off-grid electricity support and rural income generation activities through productive end use can be supported is going to be an important feature moving forward. And also, of course, taking into account future grid expansion, right? So helping us achieve some of these things, not 100%, but like definitely helps in supporting it, is the regulatory framework and the policies that we put in place to do that, right? So I think some of the general policies and regulatory conditions we'd be looking at are kind of lumped into sort of 4 categories. There are legal and licensing provisions. There's cost recovery and tariff regulation. There are risks posed by the arrival of the main grid. You know, this is a big consideration for many grid developers everywhere. And you know, of course, measures to facilitate access to finance. So these were some of the solutions that we had identified as well in the last discussion. You know, we talked quite a bit about these last time, so I'm just going to hover on this slide for a bit. Won't talk in a lot of detail about this since we'll probably hear a little bit more about them later. But we're kind of breaking them up into 3 categories, right? Institutional, that's what a lot of you guys deal with, technical, which is kind of more in the realm of developers and utilities, and then the financial aspects of it. So a little bit about the policy development cycle. I think the first step usually is analyzing the existing constraints and conditions, which is kind of what we've been doing so far in our policy briefs. We want to look at, you know, things like the electrification rates, what the status of current laws and regulations are, perhaps what are the current laws and regulations as they pertain to on-grid systems and how they can be applied to off-grid systems. The sizes of rural communities, population growth, these are important for forecasting demand. And then, of course, what are the ways in which we can engage the private sector and encourage the private sector to become involved in the process, right? Step 2 is more looking at the role of mini grids in enabling rural electricity access and breaking it into tiers of access that we can start to identify and target as being like, you know, okay, this could be the least the lowest bar that we try to achieve, and then we kind of go up through the tiers of energy access as people start to bring on more appliances and more technologies. Identifying general and I guess also, you know, the specific technology that we could use for regulating private mini grids, and you know, we start to understand some of the different technologies. And introducing and adjusting the regulatory framework to be able to suit this, right? So I think it's important for us to understand that the regulatory framework is something that we will constantly be having to develop and change. And then finally, the practical application of those tools, right? We want to be able to account for new technologies, new administrative procedures, and new grids that are being built and operated over time. And so these are some of the policies and tools that have been used around the globe to encourage reduction of carbon emissions specifically, but I think really help us in this case for bringing on more renewables specifically. And we've got a couple of specific recommendations to encourage transition to renewable energy. A lot of this is also stuff we've talked about before. So I think one of the key ones here is setting mandates. I think that this is kind of something that has come a lot out of the Paris Agreement, and we'll hoping will be coming out of the Glasgow agreements soon as well. But these really help us in kind of setting ourselves to a certain standard in making sure that we can expand. And I think the unique opportunity for Sabah is that there's a wealth of forest resources that we can also integrate into this plan, and we can look at ways in which hydro resources specifically can incentivize the conservation of forests. So just as a summary, as a recap, these are kind of some of the elements of the enabling environment, right, for accelerating off-grid access to renewable energy. We've got capacity building at the community level, the institutional and regulatory frameworks, bringing links across sectors, looking at delivery and financing models, and then thinking specifically about the types of technology, not just in terms of hydro or biomass or solar or what have you, but also thinking about the types of information technologies and cellular technologies that are available to us now to conduct monitoring in a more robust way. And I think, just in terms of the roles of the specific stakeholders, I think this is where you guys come in. We've got some of you guys who are coming from research institutions and academia, as well as some of you are developers, some of you are, most of you are policymakers. So I think, this is kind of our breakdown of how we think a lot of these, a lot of you guys can play a role in all this. But I think I'd like to leave some time for questions, but I also wanted to just show you from our last call what the results of our kind of group sort of session were on what some of the challenges and opportunities were in this space. And I wanted to show you these because we'll be doing a similar exercise today. So I think what we found generally was that there was a pretty strong focus specifically on policy and on financing. So we're hoping to be able to answer some of your questions around policy today. Thank you. And I think we've got about 5 minutes for any questions if you want to do that before we go into our presenters. Okay, so we can also field questions inside the chat as well, right, comms team? And then we'll try and answer those questions over time. I think I'll just get right into it and introduce our first speaker here. does Chris have sharing permissions?
I do, Gabe. I think I checked it out earlier.
Okay, good. So our first speaker is going to be Chris Greason, who is a associate professor, adjunct professor at the University of San Francisco. He's been working on mini-grid regulatory frameworks for a long time. He's worked on mini-grids in the field in all sorts of countries, both in a lot of it in Thailand, in Myanmar, I think even as far as North Korea, right? And I think Chris has a really unique perspective because he's got a considerable amount of experience in the field while also having a lot of experience working with governments on developing their regulatory frameworks around scaling up off-grid energy access, both mini grids and other solutions. So I think so Chris now works with the World Bank's ESMAP facility, and he's got some knowledge to share with you guys today. So without further ado, I think I'll hand it over to Chris to share some of his thoughts.
Great. Thank you. And thank you, Gabe, for the introduction and for the really great presentation a moment ago that helps put some of this in context. Let me go ahead and share my screen. Here we go. It's an honor to share with you all some thoughts on mini-grid regulations. And I think as has been discussed in earlier sessions, mini-grids are really emerging worldwide as a powerful tool to provide reliable electricity for rural areas with minimal greenhouse gas emissions. As Gabe mentioned, I work mostly on regulatory aspects of mini-grids as a consultant to the World Bank's Global Facility on Mini-Grids, which is part of the World Bank's ESMAP, or Energy Sector Management Assistance Program. And I'm going to give an overview and some background on key mini-grid regulatory issues that energy regulatory authorities encounter internationally when it comes to mini-grids. A lot of this work, and has been really common practice around the world, has focused on frameworks that accommodate private sector and community-owned projects. And I understand from really briefly talking with Gabe that in Malaysia, there's some mini-grids in this category, for example, micro-hydro projects that TONIBUNG has helped communities develop, and that there's also mini-grids that are being built by larger utilities. I think that key aspects of the regulations that I'll talk about should be relevant across these different ownership models to varying degrees. I'll also just mention that mini-grids are really taking off in a lot of the countries in Africa and Asia and the Pacific and the Caribbean that I'm working with. So in Nigeria, in Tanzania and Rwanda and Ethiopia, now in Sudan and Haiti and in Myanmar, mini-grids are really growing very quickly as a model for rural electrification. And we started with the World Bank capturing information on all the mini-grids we had in-depth information on a couple of years ago, and had about 50 mini-grids that we were looking at. And then when we did the same exercise this year, we got data on about 500 mini-grids, and I expect that growth rate is going to be continuing. So first, why regulate mini-grids? Good mini-grid regulations provide benefits to consumers, to government, and to developers. And for consumers, they help ensure high quality, affordable electricity. They help developers by making it really clear what are the conditions that provide the right to exist as a mini-grid project, and what kind of tariffs can be charged. And they also good mini grid regulations help create barriers that keep bad actors out that would build unsafe mini grids or otherwise create an unpleasant or unsafe experience for consumers. And they can also provide a lot of certainty for what happens if or when the main grid arrives. And all of these things help lower risks that equity and debt investors in mini grids perceive, and that in turn makes it easier for mini grids to obtain affordable financing. For the government and for regulatory authorities, mini grid regulations unlock the ability of mini grids to act as a tool in the government's electrification toolbox, helping them provide electricity to rural areas in places that are often unfeasible to reach in a timely manner with grid expansion, with conventional grid expansion. So let me turn now to some key issues in mini grid regulation that are under the jurisdiction of mini grid regulators. And these can be categorized into 4 different groups, pretty similar to what Gabe was talking about earlier. The first is licensing and regulation. The second is tariff setting. The third is safety and quality of service. And then finally, rules that address what happens when the main grid reaches a mini grid. In mini grid development, there's also other regulatory issues that are important, but are often the jurisdiction of other regulatory agencies, especially environmental permitting, import and customs duties on equipment, the process of registering a business, and land rights. And these are often really important to developers in setting up mini grid projects, but they're not in the hands of energy regulators. And so this presentation will mostly focus on that first set of bullet points that's under the jurisdiction of electricity regulatory authorities. So starting with licensing and registration, a license is a government granted right to conduct a business based on a determination that the licensed entity has the technical and the financial ability to carry out its business. It's a form of consumer protection, providing due diligence that prevents customers from being locked into poor services at high costs. Licenses also protect legitimate developers from competitors who don't play by the rules. However, in the mini grid space, we've also really observed that when you get to the level of hundreds or thousands of mini grids being built in a country, licensing can impose a significant administrative burden, both for the regulator and for developers. And so a light-handed alternative to licensing is simply registration, which is typically defined as more or less simply informing the regulator of the existence of the project. The regulatory authority still has authority to impose some rules, but for the smallest of projects, sometimes registration rather than licensing is allowed. So I guess one of the key questions in licensing and regulations that comes up is, should small mini grids be exempt from licensing? And if so, how do you define small? As a couple of examples of the way that some countries have gone, in Nigeria, registration is required. There's a registration option for projects that are less than 100 kilowatts. In Rwanda, they set the level at 50 kilowatts. There's another key question is, should there be a provisional license that allows developer to secure a site, to basically reserve a site and conduct studies and keep another developer from sliding in and taking that site while the company is investing in doing the community outreach and feasibility studies and so forth. And then as long as the project meets certain milestones, then is able to advance to a full operational license. moving on to retail tariffs. This has been a big issue in a lot of the countries that I've worked with. And in different countries, there's different ideas for what retail tariffs should be. Some feel that in some countries, the main sentiment is that mini grid tariffs should reflect costs plus a reasonable profit. In other countries, the general feeling is that mini grid tariffs should be kept really low through subsidies, and therefore at tariff levels that are similar to what urban customers would pay. I think one thing that we can agree on is that in most cases, the costs involved in making mini grid power is generally higher than main grid power in urban areas, because we're serving rural areas, because there's some economies of scale. And at the same time, these energy services that mini grids are providing are also a lot cheaper than things like kerosene for lighting, or buying disposable batteries and so forth. So mini grid power is more costly than large-scale centralized generation, typically for urban customers, but a whole lot less costly than some other alternatives. Costs also really vary widely depending on the technology, on the scale, and on where they're located. So one of the questions is, should regulators fix mini grid retail tariffs, or should they be based on a mutual agreement between mini grid operators and their customers? And should mini grids, if the tariffs are fixed, should they be fixed at national uniform tariffs, basically what urban customers pay for centralized electricity? And if you're going to set at those low national uniform tariffs, where is money going to come from that would help cover the subsidy that would be needed to make the mini grid viable for developers and for investors? Here's a couple of examples of ways that different countries have gone. In I think the more dominant way in Nigeria and Rwanda, Ethiopia, and Myanmar is this what's called a willing buyer, willing seller model, where regulatory arrangements allow developers and communities to arrive at a mutually agreeable tariff. And the regulatory authority typically reserves the right to step in if there's a lot of complaints, to ensure that tariffs are not leading to excessive profits on the part of the mini grid operator. But generally, regulators will kind of step back and assume that if the customers are okay with it, and the customers and the mini grid developers have worked out a suitable arrangement, then that's fine. In Ghana, mini grid tariffs were set at the national uniform tariff. That's the tariff that the urban customers pay. And these projects are typically built by the national utility. And Ghana is a country where most of electrification has already happened by grid expansion. So there's not that many areas left over to electrify. So the country and the utility could kind of afford to do that. In the case of Tanzania, I put a little star by that. Initially, it was set as a willing buyer, willing seller type model. And then in a few years ago, the government came in and they changed the law, forcing tariffs to be set at national uniform tariff levels. And this has been really difficult for the mini grid industry in Tanzania, because you had a lot of mini grid companies that had built mini grids. They'd invested in the generation and the poles and the wires, and had a business plan built around selling electricity at one tariff. And then they were suddenly scrambling to find a way to survive by selling electricity at a loss to customers in the areas that they had installed, and basically making the decision not to install any more mini grids. So it's ended up being kind of a policy decision that can be politically attractive sometimes, but can end up killing mini grid programs. And then in Haiti, there's a way of setting it where they've basically said, okay, well, the mini grid developer and customers can agree on a tariff as long as it's below a certain threshold. And that can work out okay as long as there's some kind of subsidy mechanism such that it's possible to build these projects at levels that developers are able to sell electricity at those kind of tariffs. In Haiti, it's set at 45 cents a kilowatt hour. It should be recognized, I guess, that Haiti is a market where there's pretty significant risks, and these are also solar diesel hybrid mini grids, and so the tariff there, could be substantially higher than you'd see in a country where the cost of doing business is quite a bit lower, and especially in cases where you have micro hydropower or other sources which are, even with the low cost of solar panels these days, probably able to provide lower tariffs on a cost basis. With regards to safety and quality of service, it's really a balancing act between what, on the one hand, protects customers, and on the other hand, keeps red tape and restrictions to innovation to a minimum. Minimal technical standards for mini grids help ensure that they won't electrocute people and they won't start fires, and they address reliability through standards for specific mini grid components such as poles and wires and conductors and electrical connections. There's also been developed something that's called the quality assurance framework that's helped address the issue of power quality and availability through defining different levels of service and different tiers of service and an allowable electrical quality thresholds for each of those, and a common set of protocols for measuring power quality and reliability. So that's something that might be worth looking into. It's developed by NREL, the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, specifically for mini grids, National Renewable Energy Laboratory under the US Department of Energy. Turning to some examples of safety in mini grid regulatory frameworks, and there's a whole lot. But here's just kind of a listing of a number of kind of key ones that have come up. One is that if a developer wishes to connect a mini grid ultimately to the national grid, then it has to be built to national grid code, the poles and wires. When projects are built, there's information requirements, single line diagrams and as-built drawings and O&M manuals and an inventory of the parts and technical specifications. Typically, these technical standards will require that PV panels and inverters and charge controllers and batteries all be past certain international standards, typically IEC standards, in the United States, the UL, and that they have specific warranties and efficiency levels. And then often there's additional requirements for batteries that they last a certain number of thousands of cycles down to a certain percent depth of discharge, and that they have a certain warranty. With the advent and recent, widespread adoption in mini grids of lithium-ion batteries, this has really shifted and improved. So we've gone from kind of a level of like 1,000 cycles to 50% depth of discharge being common now to at least 3,000 cycles down to 80% depth of discharge for lithium-ion batteries. It's also really important to have some safety standards around cables, that they have insulation that provides UV protection, that there's some rules around voltage drop, that wires be clearly labeled, and that there's strain relief, so that if someone pulls on a wire, it's not going to cause adverse electrical situations. And then quality of service is about the electricity itself, the quality of the the quality of the service that customers experience, and the quality of the electricity supply. So we break that into a non-technical and a technical categories. When it comes to the non-technical, it's things like the maximum number of days that a mini grid operator has to respond to improve or relocate power supply to existing customers. Some rules around disconnection and in the event of failure to pay or reconnection, how quickly the mini grid operator responds to customer complaints. And then on the quality of electricity supply, the technical side, there's generally in these mini grid regulatory frameworks, a requirement that they have a certain renewable energy fraction. In a lot of cases, this has been set at 50% of the kilowatt hours on an annual basis. With cheaper batteries and with cheaper PV panels, this is now inching upwards. I'm starting to see 70 in some regulatory frameworks. There's also regulations around allowable frequency deviations, allowable voltage deviations, and total harmonic distortion fluctuation. And then standards around allowable interruptions and outages, typically captured by the SAIDI and SAIFI indices. So one example would be that there's no more than 12 unplanned interruptions per year, or that no more than 5% of the intended service hours would be disconnected. Mini grids can be super reliable, so these could be set higher than this, especially for solar diesel hybrid mini grids. And then finally, metering requirements for accuracy of meters. And then the final issue that is often addressed in mini grid regulatory frameworks has to do with this question of what happens when there's a mini grid that had been operating in a service territory and the grid arrives typically sooner than was expected. So it may be that typically a mini grid developer won't want to develop a mini grid in an area unless they think that the main grid is at least 10 years away. But the grid sometimes expands in unpredictable ways. And so if it arrives at year 3 or year 2, what happens and what are the options? And some of the options that we've been seeing around the world are what I'll get into next. One of them is the ability to become what we call a small power distributor. So in this model, the mini grid stops operating its generation assets, but it stays in the distribution business. It keeps its retail customers and it sells electricity that it purchases in bulk from the national utility. The biggest example of this is Cambodia. And in Cambodia, as the national grid expanded and reached mini grid areas, about 250 mini grids became SPDs. Now, these were diesel mini grids by and large. And these mini grid developers abandoned the diesel generators and they purchased electricity for considerably lower cost than they could generate it themselves. And they purchased it from the national utility and then resold it to their old customers. The SPD model works really well for the transition from diesel generators to purchasing from the national utility, because the cost of generation from diesel is really high. And so, and diesel generators themselves aren't worth very much. So operators are happy to get rid of them and then repurchase, purchase that electricity at a lower wholesale cost. In Cambodia, the regulatory authority, the EAC, played a key role in putting in place a comprehensive program that supported this conversion to SPDs. And it really did two things. First, it required that mini grid operators obtain licenses. And to obtain a license, they had to invest in upgrading the quality of their distribution networks and extend the networks throughout the service territories to all the customers in that area. Grants and loans were provided from a rural electricity fund that made this process easier. And in the case of Cambodia, retail tariffs for these distribution franchises are standardized. And the difference between this tariff and a project-specific cost-reflective tariff that's calculated by EAC is paid out of a rural electrification fund that's capitalized by the main utility. So customers across the country that are served by these groups that have converted to SPDs pay a similar amount, and where there's variation in scale and location, it's picked up by a rural electrification fund that gets its money out of a surcharge that customers around the country pay. Here's a photo of one of those mini grids that transitioned in Cambodia. On the left, you can see the old diesel generator, and on the right, the medium voltage lines that come in from Electricity du Cambodge and that provide wholesale electricity after the mini grid converted to an SPD. So that's one model, the small power distributor. And the next is becoming a small power producer. And in this model, the mini grid abandons the distribution network, but it keeps its generation, and it sells electricity to the national grid at wholesale. And this works particularly well for small hydropower projects because they have zero fuel costs and they can generate 24/7. And one country where this has happened is Sri Lanka. So in Sri Lanka, there were over 250 isolated community-owned microhydro projects that were built with support from the government of Sri Lanka and the World Bank. When the main grid arrived, more than 100 of these had been abandoned. And so far, several projects, this is a bit of an old slide, but at least 3 that I know of that were in range from 12 to 45 kilowatts have converted to SPPs. Others are in the pipeline, and they, as I mentioned, are no longer providing electricity directly to village customers, but are selling it to the national utility. Here's a photo of one of those. This is the 12 kilowatt microhydropower project at Athuriyala village in Sri Lanka. And then on the right, the transformer that is connecting that to the national utility. So we've discussed the SPD and the SPP types of models. Mini grids also, really, they don't have to choose. They could be both. They can tie into the grid and keep both the generation and their distribution networks and generate electricity, selling it to local customers, and sell excess to the national grid. And when they don't have enough electricity, they could purchase it from the national grid. And in Indonesia, there's projects that have done this. About 200 community-owned mini grids are in places where the national grid has arrived, and 9 or so have become these combination SPPs, SPDs that sell some or all of their electricity to the national grid. A fairly common model that we've observed might be called coexistence, where the mini grid continues to operate separate lines and its own power plant even after the main grid arrives. And so they're operating side by side, but not electrically interconnecting. And this often we'll see in places where the electricity from the national grid is really unreliable. So the mini grid retains a pretty strong business case by providing much more reliable, but albeit more expensive electricity to customers. And one example of this is in Uttar Pradesh. It's fairly common because the rural parts of India have pretty erratic electricity supplies on the national grid. In some cases in India and in Nigeria now, mini grid developers are building mini grids in places where there's already national grid lines because they feel like they can count on the the power supply from the national utility not being very good and not improving very much in the future. Another possible option is a utility buyout, where the utility will buy a portion or all of the mini grid. So when the national grid arrives at a predetermined point, the developer is compensated for some or all of its assets, and then ownership of those assets are transferred to the utility. In Nigeria and in Tanzania, there's now regulations on the books. And I think that in Sierra Leone and Rwanda, there will also be regulations that accommodate this. In Tanzania, it's only the depreciated value of the distribution assets, the poles and wires that are built to sufficient standards. Remember earlier I said when the main grid arrives, if a mini grid project wants to be able to connect to the main grid when it arrives, it has to build its poles and wires to the national standards. In Nigeria, it's more generous to mini grid developers. It's the depreciated generation assets plus the distribution assets plus a year's worth of revenues, accommodating for the investment and time and resources that a mini grid developer has put into building this project that's now going to be displaced. As far as I know, in Tanzania and Nigeria so far, even though these provisions are on the books, they're not something that's actually happened yet. There hasn't been compensation. And then finally, the kind of not really a great option is that the assets get abandoned. And that's a case that unfortunately is fairly common. Some solar mini grid developers are guarding against this by building their equipment into shipping containers that can be easily picked up and brought to another more remote village when the main grid arrives. Here's a micro hydro project in Thailand that was obviously abandoned, fell to this fate. So this is really my last slide. For folks that are interested in this, there's 2 books. One is the mini grids and arrival of the main grid, and the other is From the Bottom Up, how small power producers and mini grids can deliver electrification and renewable energy in Africa. Sorry, I'll put it, both of these are available at this website, the palangthai.wordpress.com docs. And so there's considerably more detail and information on these types of regulatory frameworks in those free books, which can be downloaded. So thank you for paying attention to this presentation, and I'll stop and take the time for some questions.
Thank you so much, Chris. Yeah, it's I know that talking about regulatory frameworks is not something that gets everybody super excited. But you know, Chris and I have traveled to a lot of places together, thinking about these things as kind of mini grid tourists, as it were. And so it's good to have these grounded in real world examples that we can see. So that was really helpful. Thank you. I think one of the key sort of lessons that we can hear is just the issues of interconnection, which are really interesting and I think relevant for the Malaysian context as well. But I don't want to keep talking. I'd like to see if there's any questions. We've got 15 minutes left for Q&A before we break and bring on the next presenter. So go ahead. Feel free to field your questions. Thanks.
Maybe I'll just, while we're just mention that, as Gabe mentioned, well, it's not the most exciting topic in the world. It is something that we found in countries across the world really unlocks the mini grid sector. So once these types of regulatory frameworks are in place, then you start to see a lot of growth of mini grids providing electricity to rural areas. So it's important to get these things right.
Absolutely. So do we have questions from you guys?
Yep,
I
if
can.
I may.
Oh, go ahead.
Hi,
Hey,
Chris.
Adrian.
Hey, good to see you.
Good to see you.
Yeah. So yeah, thank you for the great presentation, because it gives a lot of perspective on the options that we are available for us to be considered in Sabah, especially. But I have one question about, have you encountered any like progressive way of how to divert some of these available subsidies into mini grids? And is there any cases that you have seen that is actually beneficial for both the national utility and also the mini grid developers when it comes to a lot of interest of trying to subsidize more renewable energy rather than still going to fossil fuel based subsidies? So I think these are some of the things that we can work out and will be quite prominent in decision making in this particular study that we have in Sabah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. I guess I'd just start out by mentioning that this presentation really focused on the regulatory framework, which is kind of what, at least in other countries, is what energy regulators do, and so they're like laying out the rules of the road, and then subsidies are more what I would kind of put in the policy category, and they're often handled by a different agency. So whereas the regulatory authority is doing these rules, the subsidies are handled by like a rural electrification agency or some other ministry. And the distinction is that the regulatory authority is this independent government body that's making these things, but it's generally not handling the disbursement of subsidy and monies. But subsidies in the mini grid world, the dominant model, at least in the countries that I've been working with, and that seems to work pretty well, is what they call a performance-based grant model, PBG. And the way that it often works is there's a per customer subsidy. And so we're seeing in Nigeria and Haiti and so forth, levels that are typically like $350 to $500 per customer. So the way it works is a mini grid developer identifies a site, they develop a project, and they install that project and operate it for a couple of months. And usually there's an online monitoring system that that is ensuring that electricity is being built into the prepay metering network that's uploading information every 15 minutes to the internet and so forth. Once the project's been operational for 3 months, then that subsidy is dispersed. And so if you've served 100 customers and you're getting $500 per customer, then that subsidy would be 100 times 500, which is what, $50,000. So it's a subsidy amount that's given up front, but only after the mini grid is actually built, which helps get around the problem that you don't want to give too much money before the thing is built, because who knows what might happen with the money. But it also doesn't trickle in over time. So by having it fairly front loaded like that, it helps with the mini grid developers ability to pay off their debt much quicker. And also development agencies like the World Bank and and these rural electrification agencies that they work with that disperse the money like this model because it's pretty simple. There's a verification that the mini grid was built, that it was providing electricity, that it was built to reasonable standards, and then there's a one-time payment for all of these customers. And so administratively, it's simpler than some kind of like a feed-in tariff arrangement or something. So that in my observation, when you've got mini grids that are identified by developers and built by developers, that performance-based grant model seems to be really the dominant one that I've seen. Another option or another way that subsidies happen is where in a model where the government is procuring mini grids. So based on a GIS study, a bunch of sites will be identified, and then those sites are put into lots, and those lots are bid out to developers and paid for out of government subsidy money, or a large portion of that is, and then the mini grid developer with the lowest price but meeting the technical requirements wins the project, builds the project, and then still has to sell electricity over the course of a number of years in order to recoup its costs. But that would be a model that's more of like a government-run kind of procurement-based model, but also involving subsidy. And then sometimes there's monies that are available to help with, as Gabe mentioned, the productive uses to help mini grid developers to provide loans for customers to get productive use equipment at lower cost and increase daytime load and so forth. So I guess those are three different mechanisms.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you.
I got a private message question about about some of the other regulatory concepts you described earlier. I think this is referring to specifically what you were saying, Chris, about some of the accompanying questions about land rights and resource use. So how would you, or I guess, how have other countries kind of addressed this issue, or maybe to make it kind of a more streamlined process? Have you seen any evidence of incorporating regulatory mechanisms that might have to do with some of these other fields into a single regulatory body that deals with both the licensing specifically around energy production itself, and then also looking at the other types of licensing that might be involved in building a mini grid in terms of land acquisition and so forth?
That's a great question. And I think, to be honest, I haven't seen fantastic solutions in this. Like usually, so these main things that are the jurisdiction of other regulators are environmental permitting and import and customs and how to set up businesses and land and resource rights. And often those are really firmly embedded in other agencies, right? Environmental planning might be part of an EPA type, environmental protection agency type agency within the government. Import and customs is part of the ministry that deals with customs. And so the best that I've kind of seen, the best practice that I've seen, and it's not necessarily ideal practice, is just to get work with arrangements with these other agencies and regulatory authorities to provide carve-outs that make it easier for mini grids to happen. So, example, with environmental permitting, you might have a blanket environmental. So a big problem with environmental permitting is that in the the laws in a country, it might say, anytime anybody is going to build a power plant, it's got to go through a full EIA process. And then, and mini grid developers say, oh my goodness, like I'm just trying to build a 20 kilowatt solar project. Like I really need an EIA. That's a little excessive. And so sometimes countries will say, okay, projects up to a certain kilowatt threshold or certain, you know, a hydropower project that has a weir that's no higher than 2 meters high, or other ways of quantifying something that's small and likely to have low impact, then gets either a simplified process or outright approval. So instead of a full EIA, it could just have some kind of an environmental impact note that would be a lot simpler. With regards to import and customs, having solar panels be duty free, or solar, you know, related equipment for renewable energy be at low import duties. So those are the main types of things that I've seen addressing that.
Cool, thank you.
I'd like to check in and see if there are questions from our government partners, SCSB, State Utility, UPenn, KPLB. If you have any specific questions or comments. Also from UK PACT, who are present here today. Terrence and team, any questions?
No questions from us. But what Chris was saying is quite consistent with what our regulator has imposed for Sabah as well. When he spoke about SPPs, yeah, I agree that can be one solution to the mini grids that you guys are doing. We've got certain cases that being done for these mini SPPs here, particularly for villages which are not, how do we say, not villages without approval from, well, they're not particularly villages, but they are like squatter villages, which SCSB is not allowed to provide power to. So to go around this regulation, an SPP could be the way to power this kind of villages. So everybody has rights to electricity. So this is the way how we sort of go about this rule requiring villages with proper development land rights. I guess these are dealing with land rights. Yeah, I guess that's all I have to comment on this.
I would be happy to provide copies of some of the regulatory frameworks from some of the countries that I've been referencing. Maybe I can give them to Gabe and he can make them available to all of the people on this call. Sometimes it's useful to look at what other countries have done and just look through it and say, oh, that's a good idea. We could adapt that to Malaysia or whatever is appropriate.
Yeah, that would be greatly appreciated. Thanks, Chris.
Anything from Robert from UPenn or Jean from KPLB? Morali, Shakila from UK PACT or Dr. Halim, UCSF? Ayu from ENACT?
Hi, Chris.
Hi, Ayu.
Long time no hear. That was really good. I really enjoyed hearing all the different regulatory frameworks from the other countries. Yeah, so thanks for that. I have some questions, but I think they're not really, I mean, it's more into like some of the details. So maybe I'll keep that for later or something. Thanks, Cynthia.
Yeah, we'll have we're gonna have breakout room discussions, you know, you won't have a choice except to participate for these. I think everybody. So, if you do continue to have questions over the course of the next presentation, please submit. Oh, we've got one from Ken there, looks like.
I also wanted to thank you, Chris, for sharing so many different rich experiences. I'm sure that there are ideas there of relevance. But my question is this. We can see that some government regulations have proved quite effective, and others have proved not really benefiting or even implementable. So my question is, what has helped, in your experience, what has helped governments most with designing regulations that are actually implementable and actually achieve the objectives that they're after? So it's more about the process. Those countries that have designed these regulations that have enabled good things to happen, how did they do that design process?
Thanks. That's a great question. Well, I think it's processes that are very collaborative, which it seems like, you know, judging just from the wide variety of people on this call, this is already in that direction. But regulatory frameworks where there's a lot of consultation and transparency and opportunity for discussion with a variety of stakeholders, so that it's so that the regulatory authority coming up with a draft takes the time to share that draft and have workshops inviting feedback from the broader community and particularly from developers and from community groups is really essential. And then incorporating that feedback, sometimes you know, a couple of rounds can be really useful in honing in on a regulatory framework that really works and doesn't have key points that will really cripple the industry, and at the same time provide you know, quality and reliability and low risk to customers. So I would say that collaborative process and open discussion between the regulator, between the government and the developers is really essential. And then having a process that also goes back and looks at updating it on a schedule. So maybe 3 years in, scheduling in a revision. We don't quite know what we don't know, but having the opportunity to fix things that are not optimal.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. That's very helpful. I love the idea of committing to coming back after a few years, because as you said, even the standards of reliability, all of these things, you know, with lithium ion batteries, all these things are changing so rapidly that trying to get something for the long term isn't going to work.
Yeah, the technology is changing so fast. It's like, for example, it's been, at least on the solar diesel mini grids, kind of the assumption that diesel generators are going to be necessary in order to provide sufficient backup generation in periods of extended cloudy periods. But maybe with these new longer term batteries, like iron air batteries that are coming out, that fully 100% renewable solar mini grids might be the most cost effective solution soon. And so having, on the technical side, regulatory frameworks that don't bake in things that restrict innovation is really important, and that touching back to true up the regulations to optimize again can be really useful.
Yeah, I think that that's a good point. Like, you know, making sure to build in this check back mechanism and you know, not as Chris says, bake in the regulation, but think of it as a process, and a living document is really helpful. Okay, so with that, I think we will take a break. We will ask you all to be back at 10:30 Malaysia time, so in 10 minutes from now. So
I think Gabe, do we have the poll first?
yes. So then, and then while you're breaking, we've got a poll that we'd like to share with you guys around what you guys might think are the biggest needs for support in improving Sabah's mini grid policy. So in those 4 categories that Chris and I kind of highlighted earlier, where do you think the biggest areas for support are? And everybody, please participate in this poll. Feel free to think about it while you're having your break, while you're having your coffee or your cigarette or whatever, and come back and fill it in then, or fill it in right now if you know the answer. So thanks everybody for paying attention, and I'll see you in a bit to introduce our next speaker. Cheers.
Hi, Gabriel. This is Satish.
Satish,
Hi.
welcome.
Thank you. Thank you.
Good to see you again.
Yeah. How are you?
I am well, thank you.
Yeah. Are you in Sabah?
Yeah, I'm in Indonesia at the moment.
Oh, okay.
Yep, I'm at home in Indonesia. And you're in Nepal?
I'm in Nepal, yeah.
I think the last time we saw each other, we were in Myanmar, right?
No, the Philippines.
Oh, the Philippines, right? It was Manila. You're right. Yeah, it was the ASEF.
ASAP, yeah.
Well, yeah, welcome. I'm so glad you could make it, and I know it's much earlier for you there, so thank you for being here.
It's okay now. Like it's 8:15, so it's fine.
Reasonable, more reasonable hour.
Yeah.
Sorry about that. Sorry about that conflict.
So
earlier.
I see like there's so many participants from different parts of the world, so you had to balance.
Yeah. Yeah.
Welcome,
I mean,
Satish. Gabe, sorry, do you want to share the results of the poll before we get into Satish's talk?
yeah, I'd like to do that. How do I do that? I don't know. Okay, here we go. So it looks like it's quite evenly distributed. It seems like cost recovery and tariff regulation comes out ahead as being what people are seeing as the biggest need for support, and legal and licensing provisions, which I'll agree come a close second. But I think what we can take from this is that all of them are important to support. Good. Hey, can everybody else see this?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, good.
Yep.
This is good. Yeah, definitely keep this in mind as we transition into the breakout rooms, and then go into specifically what within these sort of subcategories you think we should be discussing in Sabah. Okay, so I think I'll just assume that we have everybody back here. Just as a quick recap for those of you just joining us, we talked a little bit. I kind of started out presenting and setting the context for what we're doing in Sabah, and why we're having this discussion around policy and regulatory frameworks. And then Chris gave a presentation specifically on regulatory frameworks, the types of tools that can be used to facilitate the expansion of mini grids from the policy and regulatory side, how they've been applied throughout the world to facilitate access to renewable energy through mini grids. And now we're going to have Mr. Satish Gautam from the Alternative Energy Promotion Center, which is a agency in Nepal that has essentially a mandate to expand access to renewable and alternative energy in the country. Nepal is a really interesting case study because, you know, it's a place that doesn't really have a lot of fossil fuel resources to speak of, and have been sort of forced into this position where renewables just tend to be more make more sense from a costing perspective than in other countries. But also, I mean, if we think that it's challenging to implement these types of projects in Sabah, imagine a place where you've got communities that are located, you know, thousands of meters in elevation in the Himalayas, without any without the ability for vehicles to road vehicles to access, and things have to be carried on the backs of porters and helicoptered in. So it is quite an interesting case study when we're talking about rural energy access, particularly with hydro. Satish is the national program manager at the sort of joint UNDP Renewable Energy for Rural Livelihood project under the umbrella of the AEPC. He's got more than 25 years of experience in both off-grid and on-grid renewable energy in Nepal and throughout the Asia-Pacific region. I think his expertise also comes from initiating bottom-up approaches and individual renewable energy projects, while also having a lot of experience as a policymaker and as a civil, in the public service, in the civil sector. So I think you know, a lot of this focus has been on Nepal's small-scale hydro sector, particularly, and they've looked at a lot of the issues that we kind of discussed in Chris's presentation as well, in terms of grid interconnection policy, transitioning to enterprise-based financing, which, you know, sort of includes what I was talking about earlier with cottage industries. So yeah, we're really lucky to have him, and welcome, Satish. So I think, are you able to present from your screen, Satish? Do we have?
Yeah, let me try.
Okay. And please, if you feel like I didn't do justice, if you want to add some more about introducing yourself, feel free to do so. Thanks.
Well, thanks. Thanks a lot, Gab. That was a good introduction. Thanks a lot. Hi, everyone. My name is Satish Gautam. I'm, as Gab mentioned, like, I'm the National Program Manager of Renewable Energy for Rural Livelihood, which is a joint project of the Alternative Energy Promotion Center and UNDP. I've been in this work for more than 25 years now. I have a presentation, and then let me go quickly through my presentation, then we'll discuss and have question and answers. Sounds okay?
Sound is okay. I think you can hit play on your presentation there on the bottom.
Energy consumption by source in Nepal, you can see, like, Nepal is still dependent on traditional energy sources, mainly firewood, agricultural residues, animal waste, so on, and renewables. When we say renewables, we mean like small hydros and solar, basically. These are just like 3% of the total energy consumed in the country. Electricity generation is mostly dependent on hydropower, more than 90%. Renewables, that's solar, again, solar and small hydro, 5%.
Satish,
Yes.
could you put your presentation on slideshow mode so we can see clearer?
It's, yeah, yep, to the right. It's the little
This is one?
To the right.
Further to the right, yeah, that one.
Perfect.
Thank you.
This is the map of Nepal with grid line, and the dots are micro hydro power projects. You can see like huge area in Western Nepal is still not covered by the grid. However, like since last decade or so, Nepal has seen like rapid rural electrification by extension of the grid, and today like 93% of the population has access to electricity, mostly from the national grid and 3% from off-grid sources. I'll just go through how it has all been developing in Nepal. Before the establishment of small hydropower department in 1975, there was little electricity outside the main, Kathmandu Valley and the adjoining areas, and in the larger cities in the southern part of the country nearing Indian border. Then in 1977, Agriculture Development Bank of Nepal started providing loan and technical assistance to establish micro hydro projects. In 91, ADBN again supported for rural electrification through a private company. A major milestone was in 1984 when the government delicensed micro hydro power plants up to 100 kilowatt. That was basically, there was no registration or licensing required for generation and distribution, and the communities or the private company, whoever was developing the project, was allowed to fix its own tariff rate. Then what happened is like, there were like several hundred micro hydropower projects came on board, and they were basically for milling activities. So in 1985, the government provided subsidy to add on generation and distribution system. And 700 micro hydros actually took advantage of this subsidy, and the in the agro processing mill, they added the generator, built small distribution network, and started providing electricity. This was basically the milestone when rural electrification actually took off. In 92, government again relicensed plants up to 1,000 kilowatt, and also posted PPA rate for plants up to 25 megawatts. So this kind of made it easy for private companies to decide whether their projects were feasible or not, whether to build projects and provide electricity to the grid. It was only in 1996 the Alternative Energy Promotion Center was established with the mandate for promoting renewable energy throughout the country, and Alternative Energy Promotion Center actually started providing subsidy as per the government regulation. In 2003, another big milestone was like community electricity distribution bylaw came out, which allowed communities to manage distribution networks connected to the grid. And the government provided 90% subsidy. The communities had to come up with the remaining 10%. And this kind of spurred rural electrification even more. And in 2015, we came up with a new constitution, and it's mentioned in the constitution itself that renewable energy, small scale renewable energy will be promoted throughout the country, basically targeting improved livelihood. And 2017 Local Government Operation Act came out, which has given mandate to the local governments for renewable energy projects up to 1 megawatt and related electrification network. You can see here that actually it was after this community electrification bylaws that it really spurred rural electrification in Nepal. And you can see they have jumped from between 2000 and 2010. Whereas in AEPC, we are promoting RE renewable energy systems with people's participation, community participation. These are like, the grid is only managed by the community. It's owned by the government. Whereas in mini grids, community own and manage the systems. And also government has given a lot of emphasis and subsidies even for participation of women and marginalized groups. And the institutions that we promote are users groups. These are informal groups for small projects, whereas larger mini hydro projects more than 100 kilowatts are either registered as cooperatives or public limited companies. There are only few public limited companies, most are cooperatives. And we have also tried in some cases that the community-owned projects are actually managed by individual entrepreneurs or small companies, local companies. Some pictures on women involved in meetings, generator being transported. As Gabu was mentioning, like Nepal is very mountainous and people have to carry things on their back, and sometimes some of the equipment that cannot be dismantled have to be carried out by a bunch of people together. Again, some pictures of women technicians doing their work. 150 kilowatt TONIBUNG solar mini grid. Construction of hydropower plant, a small micro hydro power plant. And then we also have, because the people in remote areas, like they have to depend on themselves. Like it's very expensive for technicians from outside to actually go there and repair things, and it's expensive to keep operators from who are not locals. So we provide extensive training for operators and managers, and also do like refresher training regularly. And productive energy users, most of the power plants, do not make enough money for major repair and maintenance. And the government has given a lot of emphasis to develop productive energy use. These are basically enterprises using electricity. We help them to carry out business opportunity assessment, prepare business plans, also financing. There's some subsidy the government provides, but our experience is that most of these entrepreneurs are more interested in accessing loan from banks rather than subsidy from the government, which is very small amount and also a little bit hassle-some, a lot of paperwork. Selection of appropriate equipment, and we also provide them entrepreneurship development, skill training, and also try to help them with market linkages. Some productive indices you find in rural Nepal. There's a sawmill, small scale sawmill carpentry, electric lokta boiler. This is like Nepali paper making boiler using electricity from micro hydro. And the project financing has been changing a lot. This is the one like I took from the mini hydropower projects that we are supporting now. Equity is about 30%, which comes from the local, from the users, local beneficiaries, their local governments, and also some in-kind contribution. Government provides subsidy, which covers about 60% of the total cost, and then they go for loan with the banks. And we really had a very difficult time, convincing banks to provide loans to these projects. Banks are very scared of providing loan to community projects, and they want individuals, they want collateral and so on. Then we had to come up with, guarantee fund and other financial instruments to help them reduce their risk and provide loan to these rural electrification projects. Social capital building, empowerment, these are some of the impacts that we have seen. Reduction in fuel wood biomass uses, kerosene, diesel. Local resources are properly utilized. Capacity building of the local people, employment, income increment. Education also had a huge impact on education in rural areas, particularly education of girls, and also on education of people from marginalized communities. before they had electricity, like children were not doing their homeworks properly, and because they had to rely on kerosene lamps, they were not doing their homeworks properly, and in the school, like there was a very dropout rates. After electricity, they had like few hours in the evening to study, and they were performing better, and children like were attending schools much more regularly. Labor saving, drudgery reduction, and so on. Yeah, this is my presentation. Now I'd like to open the floor for question and answers.
Excellent. Thank you, Satish. That was really informative. Really good to see how you've structured incentives in Nepal to allow for greater participation of communities and other organizations as well. I think it's a pretty good lesson. So I guess just as a reminder for the speakers about who we have here as well, we have UPenn Sabah, which is essentially the economic planning unit, which sort of dictates policy for the country. Robert Steedy, who's the deputy director, is here. We also have representatives from the state utility, Sabah Sdn Bhd. We also have, I think we have somebody from Suruhanjaya Tenaga, from the Energy Commission, as well as the KPLB, which is the Rural Development Ministry, and they're typically the ones who are responsible for determining which villages get access to electricity through grid extensions and through alternative energy. Finally, we have the Institute for Development Studies, Sabah, which is the think tank that kind of informs the policy decisions in Sabah, as well as University College Sabah representatives. So I think those of you who have any questions should feel free to do so now. I haven't seen tech team if there have been questions in the chat, but please, the floor is open.
Hi, Satish. Good morning.
Yeah, hi.
Thank you for your nice presentation. It was really informative. My question is actually related to the financial viability and the financial feasibility of these projects. What are the key aspects that were taken into account to ensure that these projects are financially viable at some level?
Thanks for your question. We have been struggling with that for a long time now, making these like financially viable. The government has to time and again, provide some kind of grant to the communities. If there's a major, the government provides like some subsidy in the beginning, and then if there is some major, destruction, and Nepal, like we face monsoon, a lot of rain during this monsoon period, and a lot of landslides, floods, and these plants do get destroyed or partly damaged. And again, the government has to provide, subsidy or some grants. So actually the government wants to avoid, providing subsidy to the same plant again and again. And the idea was to make it sustainable, financially sustainable, by having them generate enough revenue so that they would be able to take care, if anything goes wrong, and also take care of the operators and other technicians, managers, people involved in running the projects. And until recently, we didn't have much option, but now the grid has been extended so much around the country that it has actually, grid extension has come up as an opportunity, so people are now interested to connect their plants to the grid. There's a provision for net metering also. So, I mean, you can buy and sell to the grid, and most of the micro hydros actually, especially the ones near the market centers, they are facing power problems during the peak hours. And so now they can buy and sell from the grid. They are selling to the grid most of the time, but buying during the peak hours for an hour or two. And we are seeing like those plants that are grid connected are actually starting to make money and be more viable. And other than that, like extensive productive energy use promotion is another strategy, right? And we can see in some areas, electricity is but one inputs for enterprise development, right? I mean, just because you have electricity, enterprises will not come up just like that. But if you have like micro hydros near a local market, then you can have like so many industries, other enterprises, different services come up, that plants are viable by themselves. So we have mixed kind of experience. And in very remote areas, if you have a larger plant, let's say if you have a 100 kilowatt plant that provides electricity to 1,000 households, and even if a household pays only 100 rupees a month, right? That's kind of 100,000 rupees. So you can actually have 2-3 operators, managers, linesmen, and so on. And we have seen like these plants, the larger plants are also quite viable. But for smaller plants and plants near the urban areas where people have started, using smart meters, we are seeing like decline in revenue. Because with the meters, people are using less electricity, they are more efficient, using efficient lamps, LEDs, and so on. So actually the plant load factor has gone down in many small micro hydros.
Okay, thank you so much.
Good morning. Can I ask a question? I'm
Sure.
Dr. Halim. Yes. First of all, thank you to all the three speakers. Yeah. My question to Mr. Satish is this. The project so far in Nepal, and it can be applied to Sabah as well, is it just a project extending electrification so that this is just so that everybody can be included in the mainstream, and the benefits they get just happens to be on its own, or rather electrification is being brought in a more holistic manner, meaning there was a thought on what are going to be the benefit to the community when electricity comes in. How is the situation in Nepal? Thank you.
Thanks again. Very interesting question. Actually, it started as a right. Electricity was seen as a right. Everybody has the right to have like access to electricity. And later on, like when the government promoted electrification works, and people thought, the plants would be sustainable. There, once you have electricity, there will be industries will just come up, and so on. But it didn't happen. Actually, when the king at that time in 1975 announced the creation of this department, he mentioned that electricity will be provided to district headquarters for industrialization and employment generation and so on. But it didn't happen on its own. So later on, like it was only in 1996 that the government decided that we needed to have some extensive program support to the communities on productive energy uses as well, so that they could actually take benefits of electricity. And from 96, it became more holistic, and in the meantime, between 1985 and 1996, let's say, there were plants that were doing the milling work, mechanically. And since these plants already had like their end users, they're already profitable with the milling activities. Just adding generator and providing electricity to the rural communities was also profitable. And also, electricity was seen as something that could be done very cheaply in these plants. And the government, that's why provided subsidy. Did I answer you?
No, yeah, it answered basically, but I just want to know another aspect. So when you say the government moves into a more holistic way of bringing electricity to the rural area, do they monitor as well what was expected to happen did happen? And there is like an annual report to show the holistic project did take off?
The holistic approach was like basically, there were few key things. One was like empowering the people by involving them, by making sure that they participate in the projects. And what we have seen, actually, there's no report, but from anecdotes, what we see is that a lot of elected politicians, actually, they started their career as micro-hydro managers or, chairman of these users groups and so on. So it has kind of, in that sense, it has been successful. But on the other hand, like if you go to very remote areas, we are still struggling with productive uses and so on. So in very remote areas, I would say we haven't been able to realize what we started to do. But moderately accessible areas with a lot of tourist traffic and so on, yes, we have been quite successful in doing the holistic, achieving the holistic, improving their livelihood itself. So it really depends on the location of the plant.
Thank you very much.
It looks like we have another question in the chat from Peter Kalang. Were there any regulatory requirements which you found challenging? I suppose that means were there regulatory requirements that stood as barriers to expanding the alternative energy program? And then the second question is, were there any substantial contributions from the government to make the initiative possible? Peter, feel free to jump on if you want to clarify your questions further. I don't know, Satish, if you can respond based on that.
It's okay. I allow that gentleman to answer it, Mr. Satish. Welcome.
Yeah, thank you. Let me answer your second question first. The government has been involved a lot in Nepal. Actually, it's because of the government's initiatives, government's proactive, policies and so on, that we have been able to see growth of micro-hydro in particular and rural electrification in general. So government has been involved in all aspects, from providing, from preparing policies, deregulating, allowing people to establish their own energy systems, fixing tariff and so on. And actually, you didn't have to go anywhere. You could just build up a power plant and then sell it to your neighbors. It was just, so easy. It is becoming a little more, more regulated now, because the government, there's this conflict between private developers and the communities now. The private developers want to build like larger projects that are profitable, whereas the community wants to build like smaller projects that they can take care of, and communities would be happy if the private sector were providing them electricity, if they didn't have to do anything. But then it takes time, right, to build larger projects. So now the government is trying to regulate, who uses water, where, and trying to encourage larger projects rather than micro hydros and small hydros. And this is creating some schism between communities and the government on the one hand, and also the private sector. And a lot of larger power plants in Nepal actually face local challenges. People are not happy with these big plants because their way of life is disturbed, but then all they get is electricity. They don't get much benefit out of it. So there is some conflict, of course. And the government tried to solve this by mandating that at least 5% of the revenue generated has to be spent in that region, and on projects that is decided by the local people. And that has helped avoid conflicts to some extent. But still, 5%, people think 5% is using their resources to bring electricity to the urban areas, and they get 5%, that they think is like too little. Whereas the private companies, they think 5% is a lot, and there won't be much profit left for them. So there is conflict, of course. And other than that, when we started in the 70s and 80s, the situation was such that you could just build plants, right, and sell electricity. But now, because they're the grid is coming, sometimes when a private company is developing a micro hydro, the grid comes to the village. And because the grid electricity is cheaper than micro hydro electricity, most of the villagers opt to go for the grid. And these people have a huge debt that they haven't paid off yet, and there's conflict. Some of them go to the court, some of them just try to disturb the local systems and so on. So we are seeing conflicts nowadays. What is challenging? One, grid used to be big challenge until recently. Now, as we have this net metering provision, grid is actually becoming more of a friend now for micro hydros. You can sell to the grid, and you can improve your plant load factor from 10, 15, 20% to 60, 70%, and make some money out of it. And there are many plants that want to connect with the grid, but the grid owner is reluctant, on the other hand. They are doing it very, very slowly, approving each project at a time and taking a lot of time to approve these projects. So there are other challenges like that.
Atish, I have a quick follow-up question.
Sure.
Oh, please, Chris.
What is the feed-in tariff that these projects get when they sell electricity to the grid?
It's like let's say, in terms of dollars, it will be 8 cents, maybe 8 cents.
8 cents.
Yeah, 8 cents during the dry season and 4 cents during the wet season.
And one other question. Oh, go ahead.
If you go for net metering, your buying and selling rate is the same, right? And if you sell more, you get money. If you buy more, you have to pay. So because the micro hydro power plants are selling electricity for maybe 20 hours a day, right? Or 22 hours a day, but buying electricity only for 2 hours, it's kind of good for them at this moment.
And when they buy, do they buy at a higher tariff than they sell, or is it's the same either way?
It's the same. It's the same rate.
So they can sell at 4 o'clock in the morning and buy at 7 in the evening, and it's the same rate.
Yes, yes. I don't think this will last for a long time.
Right. Imagine utilities not super happy about that, but one other question.
Sorry, Chris. That's one of the reasons why the utility is so reluctant to connect micro hydros.
Yeah.
Yeah, please go ahead.
The other question is a little bit different, but you mentioned that sometimes these are community owned, but privately managed. I wonder if you could speak a little bit more about that model.
We call this model community private partnership, CPP model. We tried in a few microhydros. Actually, there was one microhydro in Western Nepal, which wasn't running very well. And the guy who was running, actually, he knew he could make more money, you know, if he had the authority to make all the decisions. So he approached us and said, could you help me convince the community that if they would allow me to run this plant, I could provide better electricity, you know, more reliable electricity, especially during the evening hours. And I could use, you know, off-peak electricity to sell to other product end users. And so we helped him do this. And the community and this person, they signed an agreement. He's paying to the community what they were making, 5 times more than what they were making actually. And the community was quite happy. And he's making a lot of money also. And this is a very small 29 kilowatt plant. And he used we calculated his plant load factor. It was like almost 70%. You know, he was utilizing 70% energy. He had like, you know, schedules for different industries. Bakeries were allowed like only at night, so that fresh products would come out like early in the morning, and they had enough time to sell that to houses, you know, go from house to house and sell that. He had a press, he has a press, and so on. So there's so many, I think there are like more than 100 enterprises operated by this 29 kilowatt plant. So if you have situations like that, you know, where the plant can make money, the private sector is interested. And what we have found is like, if the private sector or an entrepreneur comes forward, and I mean, they can make money, right? So they're always planning like how to sell electricity, when to sell electricity, encouraging people to establish enterprises. Whereas in community projects, like you don't see this kind of, you know, enthusiasm, this kind of working all the time to make money. And this was like, when this guy started making money, other people saw it, and his consumers were happy because they were getting electricity when they need it. He doesn't sell electricity to enterprises from 5 o'clock in the evening till 8:39. So his consumers were also happy. And this was like related to other villages. And other villages also approached him to run their plants. But it wasn't the same success story, because other plants like did not have as many enterprises. But nonetheless, you know, people, at least in 2-3 microhydros around this one, are quite happy that this guy is running it for them.
Great, thanks. There's another question fielded in another chat. You stated that many systems were unlicensed and unregistered.
Mm-hmm.
How are tariffs negotiated for these projects?
I mean, it used to be like, the easiest thing was like 1 rupee per watt per month, right? That was kind of standard everywhere. Everybody understood that. So it was flat tariff, dependent on number of watts you subscribed.
And it's still like that now. You're talking about is it metered, or is it just with a?
And nowadays, like people want metered electricity, right? So that they can have some kind of control on their consumption and try to bring their consumption down, bring their tariff down. It used to be like mostly unmetered, and it was controlled by MCB. You subscribe certain watts, and they would give you certain MCB, and then you'd pay for that.
Right. Okay, I think we have time for probably 1 or 2 more questions before we break into the breakout rooms, but if we don't, we can do that early. Are there any last questions that anybody, our consortium members or partners in the government would like to ask before we break into the breakout rooms?
If there's
Okay.
not any other questions, I have one quick one again. So you mentioned metering, but the importance with microhydro, of course, of having a high load factor. When people are moving to metering, are these just standard kilowatt hour meters, or are you seeing kind of time of use rates that encourage off-peak usage to increase the load factor?
TOD meters, like, they're very new, only a few microhydros, especially, in areas where there are other productivity uses. I can think of like three or four power plants that have like TOD meters, discouraging, industries to use during the peak hours and discouraging people to use during the off hours. Some of the microhydros have started putting smart meters also, especially in this. I don't know whether you know Lukla, right, Chris? That's the gateway to Mount Everest. In that region, people have smart meters because they have like a lot of uses for electricity, laundry, cooking, heating, water boiling, and so on. And these things are encouraged during the off hours.
So the smart meters have that kind of time of day function.
Yes.
Okay, I think we'll have to wrap it up there. We've got this next group exercise coming up. I think one of the comms team guys are going to explain what's going to happen next. We're going to separate into 2 breakout rooms. So, is it Ken? Are you going to?
Yep.
Can you? Okay, thanks.
Hi, everyone. So after this, we'll be separating into 2 breakout rooms. One is, we'll just call it the Satish room, and one is Chris's room. They each have different categories to be discussed. And yep, Katrina just told me that she is already separated. So after I give an introduction, you guys are just going to the room. But let me just give a brief introduction of what the exercise will be. It's called Jamboard. I'll share my screen. So once you go into the rooms, we will drop a link. You can see this Google link into the chat in that breakout room so you can access this. But essentially, just look at these 2 questions. How we answer them. You just go here, you can see a sticky note on the left side panel. As you click it, you can type things. For example, I'll just put something random. Hi there. Whatever is relating to these 2 questions, then you can just post it there, and we will organize it and categorize it based on your answers. So yeah, any further questions you can ask during the breakout room, as we have the tech team on each side, but also moderators. Gabriel will be in Satish's room, and Nida will be in Chris's room. So yep, any further questions, just ask there. Thanks.
Perfect, thanks. So we have in both groups the same 2 sort of broad questions. One is around what regulatory policies or mechanisms are already available in Sabah that you think could be adapted to improving the rural energy access framework. And then the second one is on new policies that you might have learned about through this presentation that you think might be applicable within the Sabah context. So As Ken just explained, we'll have these cool little post-it features. A link will be shared in each of our groups where we can access those files, and they'll talk us through how to do that specifically within those groups. So, Cynthia, did you?
I just want to add one. Just to add one thing, is that for each group, could you choose someone to come back when we come back to the main group to present the sort of findings or conclusions of your conversation? You can use the board itself to, to refer to. So pick someone, not Chris or Satish, but someone else to kind of summarize your discussion. Thanks.
So I think we'll start with that. Once people are ready, why don't we share, one of the comms team members, please share the screen and show us what you managed to pull together. Okay.
All right. So we discussed quite a bit about both these questions. And for the first question, what policies and regulations already exist that mini grids could incorporate, would be two important things. One is the license requirement by ST. They mentioned that projects which have the capacity of less than 72 kilowatt and ones which are used for household purposes, they don't require any special licensing, but above 72 kilowatt, ones which are used for business purposes, commercial purposes, they need licensing. They have licensing requirements. And for the tariff rates, those are set by the Energy Commission that could be that we could incorporate. Okay, and I think for future policies, probably this would go on the second question, right? Because this is for future. So anyway, one of the things that we got to know is that maybe in the next 2-3 years, all these key decisions for regulations and policies would be handed from the federal government to the state government of Sabah. And that could help in streamlining the process for these projects. And as we see for question number 2, we have a couple of indicators given that could help the deployment of these mini grid projects. One is the subsidies and devising smart subsidies for these projects could make them financially viable and sustainable. Then Chris mentioned that probably a process to carve out at the federal level to allow Sabah, to create its own regulations and probably put them in black and white would help in in getting to know about these regulations better and have them explicitly mentioned. Then all right, so he also shared these technical guidelines that were seen in this Rwanda project, which includes both solar and micro hydro mini grid systems. Probably a read through these regulations would help us understand what are the requirements, what could be taken from these projects and incorporated into our Sabah roadmap project, and for future projects as well. And yeah, and the fourth one I already mentioned that the mini grid deployment projects would come under the Sabah state government, but that could take time, maybe 2-3 years, I'm not sure. So yeah, this was the discussion from our room.
That's great, Nida, thanks. I think, yeah, these are some really solid suggestions and recommendations. Also, it looks like there's definitely somebody who's who knows the current regulatory framework with regards to small projects quite well. And these are some good suggestions. I think, yeah, bringing up Sri Lanka is quite relevant. You know, this is a country that managed to go from 30% electrification rate to something like over 80, almost 90% within the span of just a couple decades. So yeah, granted, small country, but also a really interesting case study. We'll hear a bit more about them as we talk about financing in another workshop, but I think those are some really good examples. So thank you for that. Any questions before we jump to the next group? Cool, thank you, Nida. And now, if we could bring up the other Jamboard, and I think, okay, good. Dr. Halim, you ready to chat about this a little bit and tell us what's going on here?
Yes, okay, thank you very much. If I fail to deliver everything that the members of the group could add on, yeah. As to the first question of policies and regulatory mechanism that's available, same they are in the, if I use my little listing, they are already what we call informations here, readily available that we could look into. In this column here, SEDA is already mandated to expand and they could get involved in the regulation. There is a concern of funding where there is like a request to reduce complexity in accessing funding for green technology. I think this is something always a concern for many projects. And there are two questions here asking whether with the available platforms, is it wide enough to allow especially community-based local energy grids and so forth can participate in actual state planning. This is to ensure that there is what we call inclusivity, where the people who are going to get the impact of electricity have a say in how electrification actually comes into their community. And also it's whether the present framework in the next box asking whether it is wide enough to address what you call whether we are moving. I think this was a question I raised to Mr. Satish just now. Are we moving from merely providing electricity because the government needs to show that it does electrify the state, or we move in a higher level where many people are brought in to decide, okay, electricity as an enabler for the development of a community, so that it does not end by saying, yes, we have done electrification and then leave things as it is. As Mr. Sati said, even in Nepal, from 1996 onward or something like that, they look at a more holistic way of thing. So the next question was, what new policies and mechanism can be incorporated? It seems there is a recommendation of a rural enactment, including targeted subsidies. And then there is also a request for a standardized protocol for the main grid connection, a revision of the BELB guidance, yeah, so that I make it more inclusive, and also for a clear tariff structure. So that belongs to one cluster. The other cluster here talks about a one-stop agency mandated to address and regulate rural electrification. The other one is similar in nature, I mean, create one organization to regulate in terms of policies. This next cluster is to establish a competence center in Sabah to improve design and implementation of mini-grid, facilities for training. This is capacity building, and also for the capacity building training of administrative and communication personnel. Okay, so that belongs to the other cluster. The final cluster is requesting for more transparent system to bid for rural electrification projects. I assume this is either done by private sector or community-based. And then also licensing for mini-grid and open energy market for mini-grid developer. On the other hand, there is also whether Sabah is looking at the framework for creating an energy ecosystem where participants can be made of from the state agency, the private sector, and also a community base. Meaning we are looking for the best combination in this ecosystem, or are we going to be eventually straight private driven? Yeah. Then the final address is expand village selection finalization committee to ensure effectiveness. This is basically to use probably the present jawatan kuasa so that the community has a say in the development of electrification. I think that sums up basically how we look at the two questions. If I miss anything, any of the member, please do add on. Thank you very much.
Nicely done, Vice Chancellor.
Yeah, very well done, very well delivered. Yeah, it seems like there's some really good ideas here, guys, and it seems obvious that that some of these came from the government agencies and regulators themselves. So that's really good. Yeah, I think we're coming up to time here, so I just wanted to say thank you. I mean, I speak with these guys. I've spoken with them quite frequently over the years, and I still manage to learn something new every time they present. So for me, it was really valuable, and I hope it was the same for everybody else involved, and the senior officials and members of government that we had attending the call. I know some of them had to leave for other meetings. But we will be sure to follow up with some of the questions raised through these breakout rooms. I think generally we'll be looking more towards looking and targeting what trends we find in these Jamboards and start to think about how our project can start to address these. But I think that's all you're going to hear from me today. I'd like to pass it over to Cynthia to kind of close out the session and give the closing remarks. So thank you very much, everybody. Cheers.
Thanks, Gabe. And thanks so much to Chris and Satish for chiming in with your wide expertise into the Sabah context. We don't have a couple of our senior government officials had to leave for other meetings, but we do have a handful of folks here. Rather than have someone say a closing note, it would be great to hear from SESB. Was this helpful, useful? Gaddafi, I see you there. Peter from Sarawak, I know you guys are also grappling with some of these issues. It'd be great to hear, just a brief hi from you. Yeah. Sort of a last couple of notes. Gaddafi, I see you've unmuted.
Yep. Thank you, Cynthia, for inviting us to this discussion. And so I think it's very fruitful that we've learned what is happening and what has been done in other countries. We can take the good parts of it and learn from any mistakes that they've made. So I think moving forward, I think we've got the context or any other further info we can share or get more experience on this matter. Yeah. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Gaddafi. Peter, Dr. Halim, have some, as an academic, how was this landing with you, this discussion?
Well, honestly, I am still learning. This is something quite new, but I like the green aspects that is being trying to promote, though it was not much highlighted. But my concern would be is basically, we don't go about electrification project just something as a basic need. But I think it's about time Sabah should look at how, like the roads it developed and so forth, supposedly to benefit the rakyat. Similarly, I think electrification should be looked at as an enabler. But before getting this project to the community, there should be participation from all sides to see how electricity could actually improve in reality the community that's being served. We wouldn't like something that goes in eventually it destroy the culture or the economic perspective, activity and so forth. And then finally, if it's privatized, the rakyat from being able to survive now become poor because they need to pay the bills and so forth, something like that. So I would like to see a more, call it holistic way of how this enabler will come into a community. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Dr. Halim. Peter, last word.
Thank you very much, Cynthia, and thank you very much for having me. I think I'm the only one from Sarawak here. I may be mistaken, but anyway, I'm really impressed, because in the 3 regions, Sabah, Sarawak, and Semenanjung, I don't know, maybe you are more in line with what they are doing in Semenanjung than us, because our Sarawak Energy is the sole provider of power here in Sarawak. Yeah, as far as the power grid is concerned and all that, we don't have any private power provider here. But while we were discussing there, what came to my mind is something that is more like what Bani and TONIBUNG are doing now, to empower the people instead of a monopoly by the state-owned corporations. So that would require a lot of changes in both the policy and the infrastructure as well. So that would be much better, because that would have because we heard from what they do in Sri Lanka, or where was it? So they started in the 70s, 80s, and now they are going on 80% coverage. Now we are going very fast in Sarawak with the SARES program that they have. This is SARES, for those of you who are not familiar with Sarawak Power, this is the initiative by the government to use solar system in order to power. These are all island system. They are not connected into any mini grid or anything like that. But the thing that I find not really good about it is it is free, but it is just meant for lighting. That is not the idea that we have in power system. Power should be enable them to allow the small industries and all that, and also allow us to train technicians, allow people to manage it. Maybe they can build a cooperative society around that. So that would be, I think, a better approach rather than, having the big corporations like Sarawak Energy to build solar system for them, and later on they will get connected into the grid and then have to pay the power. That will be a big shock to them, cultural shock. So thank you very much. But I hope that you can have one similar program for the whole nation one day. I would love to see that happening, so that we can compare what is going on in the 3 different regions. Thank you.
Thanks, Peter. Great. So I think we've heard from a sort of range of folks. We're very thankful to SCSB because we have our lights on and our internet on, otherwise we wouldn't. So I think this effort is about diversity and resilience, particularly in a climate context for the future.